This session is protecting data in use from firmware and physical attacks, and I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much for coming. I think it's going to be a very interesting session. As Paul said, my name is Steve Weis, and a little background on myself. My background's primarily been in cryptography and information security. And right now I'm the CTO and co-founder of a startup called PrivateCore, which is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I used to be on the Google security team, and as I mentioned, I did a PhD in crypto. So the topic of physical and firmware attacks is something that's relatively new for me and something I've gotten interested in the last couple of years, because as we're looking at the adoption of people running things in the cloud, you've given up control of that physical hardware, and in things like Amazon, you've given up control of having that bare metal access, of being able to actually control and see what firmware is running beneath a virtual machine. So I think this is actually a very interesting problem of how do we actually address the fact that you don't have physical control over a machine. Now, today's talk is really based on a lot of other people's work. And I recognize some faces in here that are up on this, but if you download the white paper that's linked there, I tried to get a lot of references here of the people's whose work, really I'm discussing today. So I'm going to be talking about several different classes of attacks on the firmware and physical level, as well as some of the defensive technologies that can mitigate those risks and things in the pipeline. So technologies that we'll expect to see in the next couple of years. So to start out with, I've got a picture of a couple servers here. And I'll come back to this later, but if you can take a look at it and see if you can actually spot the malicious hardware implants in these servers. And imagine that you had a whole data center of servers and would need to spot the piece of hardware that's malicious. So I'll come back to this and show you where they actually are and what kind of attacks they can conduct, but we'll come back to that. So the first class of attacks I'm going to talk about are pretty familiar to the Black Hat community and the security community, and these are boot integrity attacks. And these are the types of attacks that would target the firmware and everything that boots up while a system's coming up. Now, a good motivating real-world example are some of the revelations that came out last December about the NSA ANT catalog. So these came from some documents that were revealed by a privacy advocate named Jake Applebaum, as well as some journalists from the Spiegel Online. And this catalog is essentially a bunch of exploits and tools and attack methods that allegedly the NSA can deploy against a wide variety of devices. So things like servers, routers, networking equipment. And if you look at this link on the bottom, it actually has a really great kind of cross-referenced catalog of some of these different programs showing how they tie together. Now, one example program that that drew my attention is one called Deity Bounce. And again, these are all alleged, so we don't know if they're actually being used, but the general understanding is that these are authentic leaks. So Deity Bounce targeted Dell servers specifically, and their method of infecting it was taking a USB stick, putting it into a server. That would compromise the BIOS, and that compromised BIOS would run some malicious code in the SMM of the system. Now, just as a little refresher of why they're targeting the BIOS and SMM, SMM is system management mode. And this you can think of essentially as the highest level of privilege. Some people call it ring -2. And the way it works is that there's a small region of memory called the SMRAM that's inaccessible to the operating system, and it's initialized by the BIOS. So if you can control the BIOS, you can get code running in that SMRAM, and it's going to be invisible to anything that's running at the operating system level. So it's a really great place to target if you want to compromise a machine and have it be invisible and have it not be detectable from the operating system level. Now, Dell servers aren't the only target. They also had references in this diagram to implants in Juniper routers. Firewalls. They also had similar programs for Cisco and Huawei and other equipment providers. So they're targeting all sorts of equipment with similar attacks. BIOS, SMM. One interesting thing from this catalog is they had dates and costs. So this has been around at least since 2008, and the cost they had in there was 0. It's been known to the kind of security community for even longer than that. So we expect that if the NSA is allegedly doing it, and we've known about it for a long time, almost certainly this is being used by other people in the wild. Now, BIOS and SMM isn't the only kind of game in town when it comes to firmware attacks. So there's been many other attacks targeting other pieces of firmware. And one example from this catalog is called Irate Monk. And this targeted hard drive firmware. And this modified firmware that they would attack would actually modify the master boot records on that disk and would persist across OS installations. And again, this has been around for years, software, so there's no cost to it, and there's evidence it's being used in the wild. So when you look at all these pieces of firmware, I mentioned the BIOS and hard drive firmware. If you look at the white paper and bibliography, it's almost like every single piece of firmware in a typical server has had some vulnerabilities and has been exploited. So things like keyboard controllers, USB controllers, EFI, some of the system management modes, IPMI, pretty much everything down the line has had some vulnerabilities in it. So it's really a large attack surface that if you can compromise anything on this, these pieces of firmware, you can compromise the operating system and any application or data that's running on that server. So another class of attacks that I'll move on to are DMA attacks. And DMA is direct memory access. And again, this has been known for a long time to the security community. It's nothing new. But again, this came up in this NSA ANT catalog to show that this is being used allegedly in practice. So this program is called GINSU, and it's interesting because it actually combines hardware, software, and firmware attacks. And they have a PCI device which is intended to jump an air gap. So the idea would be that you put in a PCI device in a server, that server could be completely isolated, and they're going to use that to exfiltrate data over a wireless communication link. Now, as we went and looked back kind of over the history of people doing these DMA attacks, one that came up from the late 90s was called Tribble. And this is from Joe Grand, who was at the Loft, one of the Loft guys. And he had built this, or taken a system evaluation board and written some software to have it dump the contents of memory from over a serial port. Now, if you notice in this picture, it's a little hard to see, but this is the Tribble kind of sitting in a board, and this is where you have it in a box. And it's actually bigger than the motherboard it's plugged into. So it's pretty old school technology. As I said, it's a PCI interface and outputting over serial, so it's slow. But the concept is there. There's also one called Copilot that was designed for actually checking memory for malware and other devices that have been talked about. So this is something you can do very easily yourself. And I think there's another Black Hat talk from Joe about doing exactly this, reproducing some of these NSA ANT attacks. And we did this ourselves. And so this picture, and it's a little hard to see with the contrast, but it's going back to that spot the implant picture. And you can see there's a card here that I've circled in red. A little hard to aim there. But this is an off-the-shelf intelligent network adapter device. And this particular one's from a company called Cavium. And what this card is essentially a standalone computer. It's got CPU, memory, networking. You can run Linux on it. And it'll boot independently of the host it's plugged into. So you can buy one of these off the shelf, put it into a server like this. It looks like a network card, but it's really running whatever you want and can access memory on that system. So we can use this to exfiltrate the actual runtime memory of a system over that network interface. And as I mentioned, we'll talk about some countermeasures later in the talk, so that there are ways to mitigate this, but very easy, and there's off-the-shelf tools. There's also some interfaces that expose DMA attacks. So going back to some of the early iPods, people were able to use the Firewire interface to actually conduct a DMA attack against Mac laptops. Thunderbolt is also a bit concerning because it actually extends the PCI bus outside the computer itself. So this picture on your right is we've got a chassis here. This is a Thunderbolt chassis. We've plugged that Cavium card into it and then plugged that into a laptop. And we're able to do a DMA attack against, this is actually a Mac laptop running Linux. But essentially this PCI bus is extended outside the laptop and makes it very easy. You can imagine that if I was using a Thunderbolt display here, that could go to a hub with any sort of device into it. So this is an interface that is one to worry about with DMA. Now moving on to the last category of attacks I'm going to talk about today is actually physical memory extraction. And this might be one of the hardest that we haven't really come up with good solutions to until recently. So systems that run today, the expectation is that the main memory is volatile. When you shut down your computer, you lose the contents of memory and it's gone. And because of this, people treat that as trusted. If you run a server, all the contents of memory are sitting there in plain text. So your code, any sort of data, any crypto keys are all sitting in memory. Well, there's several ways we can actually access that memory on a running system or walk away with it. So one that's a bit clunky is just having a memory bus analyzer. And this is just an image I've grabbed from Google of something that's sold as a memory bus analyzer, generally for debugging purposes. And you can tell it's pretty big and clunky. It'd be hard to install on a system without being able to notice it. But you could build a similar device using other technologies. People have discussed using FPGAs or other sort of things that could be an interposer between the memory and the rest of the system. Now, that requires you to put a device in the system before it's actually running with anything. So about 2008, there was a revelation about a cold boot attack. And this is from a group of researchers at Princeton. And they literally took a aerosol spray, which costs like $5, and freeze the physical memory in a system. And the interesting property here is that memory will retain its contents for several minutes. So the picture of the laptop is their original shot. We reproduced this with this one on the left of just freezing it on a motherboard. But it's something you can do on your own, and you can walk away with the contents of memory. Anecdotally, I've had some friends in law enforcement say they're doing these attacks in practice. And they said a 75% success rate. So I don't know if that means 75% of the contents of memory or 75% of the times they get it to work. But this is being used out there. So cold boot is a real, practical way of actually getting memory. Now, it's obviously disruptive in this case. So you're going to shut down a system and pull out the memory. Somebody will notice. So one concern is a technology that's becoming more prevalent, which is non-volatile RAM. And the idea here is, this is the other picture I showed at the beginning. This has a supercapacitor actually attached to the memory. And the memory also has some flash storage, like you'd find in a camera or phone. And the idea is when the system's powered off, it'll copy the contents of memory to that flash and persist it for up to 10 years. So my attack here is that I get some non-volatile RAM in your server and I pull the power. And at some other later time, I can actually just pull that out and walk away with it. So memory is really becoming like a disk. And today it's completely unencrypted. So all the things we're doing with encrypting disk, which is a good practice, we're leaving memory unencrypted. Now the thing with non-volatile RAM is that there's several technologies in the pipeline, like MRAM and PCM, that are persistent. So I would expect in the next 5 to 10 years we'll start seeing more servers running with persistent main memory and with just all memory systems and not having a disk and being all in memory. So let's move on and talk about some defenses and mitigations. And I'll talk about a few tools and technologies out there that can help with some of these problems. So going back to some of the boot integrity attacks and firmware attacks, there's some diagnostic tools available that you can actually use to look at your firmware. So Flash ROM is just kind of a generic tool for accessing firmware. It's not security specific, but is available and is open source. Intel ChipSec, this is a pretty recent tool that came out, and I think they're actually demoing it over in the arsenal right now. So you can catch it at the end of this talk. This is a platform for assessing the security of the firmware, so you can look at the different settings and see if you can modify the BIOS. Copernicus is another tool that's very similar from MITRE. There's a couple versions out there, and again, it's a way of actually reading the BIOS and seeing if the settings on the system will allow you to modify it. Now, when it comes to the boot integrity attacks, one approach to mitigating it is a verified boot. And some of the terminology that's used, I think Microsoft uses the phrase secure boot. This is from a Chrome OS diagram, which they call verified boot. But the main idea is that you've got some small trusted read-only memory, and it's hard to see in this picture, but it's at the top of this chain. And that's got a key, a public key in there that can verify a signature on the next chunk that's actually going to load. So you've got something rooted in hardware, it's read-only, and it'll verify a signature of the thing that loads next. And the next block, okay, aim over there, next block down the chain will be verified by the one previous. So the idea is that as you go through this boot process, every step of the way is verified by the previous step. So this is being used in Chromebooks today, and I think more recent version of Windows also have a similar mechanism. But it's actually a pretty good mitigation for this. So if somebody comes in and changes one of these pieces of firmware, the signature verification should fail, and you shouldn't boot, or it should give you some warning. Now, Chromebooks actually have a way of work around this to let people run their own operating system that may not have these chains. So you can disable this check. Now, another technology with similar goals that works slightly different is called Trusted Execution Technology, or TXT. And in this picture, I've got all the firmware and software that is required to boot up the system. And what's happening is this is going to get measured by the CPU using kind of a special state and instruction. And the CPU will take those measurements and put them into registers on a trusted platform module, so a separate piece of hardware. And after boot time, you might have booted up something malicious. Somebody else can connect to the system and actually do a remote attestation protocol directly with the TPM. And what they'll get out of this is a signed manifest of everything that booted on that system. So what you're seeing here in these columns, that's a little hard to read, but these are the special registers on the TPM, and these are just hash values. And on the right, I've kind of denoted what they are. So the BIOS, authenticated code modules, measured launch environment, kind of everything that booted up with the system. Now, TXT is not perfect. It's got some flaws. So in the past, there have been a couple vulnerabilities. The first version of TPM 1.1 had a paperclip vulnerability where you could reset the system and get the TPM out of sync. There have also been some overflows in the SINIT, which I think that was discovered by Invisible Things Lab several years ago. Currently, there are some risks as well. So the provenance of the BIOS and the firmware, you don't really know what's good and what's bad. So you can measure it, but who tells you whether it's good or bad? And the vendors haven't really supplied that information. There's a Black Hat talk a few years ago in Black Hat DC where they demonstrated extracting keys from the TPM, so that can be done. And so I can spoof a TPM and actually have my device lie about the measurements it received. And also that bus, this is called an LPC bus, a low pin count. That's also very easy to interpose and spoof measurements across. So kind of hypothetical, going back to like the state actor scenario, these authenticated code modules are signed by keys that would come from the vendor. So if I was a state actor, I would go after that signing key and issue my own modules, or my own microcode update keys for that matter. Also, this is the SHA-1 hash on the current version, so if you had a lot of compute capability and new ways to break SHA-1 or find collisions, you could find collisions with, for bad firmware that would look like good firmware. And also you might be able to spoof the CPU itself and just have that lie about its measurements. Now, moving on to some DMA mitigations. So a technology called IOMMU. This is for IO Memory Management Unit. One example is from Intel. It's called VTD, which is a virtualization technology for directed I/O. This was originally designed to virtualize devices for VMs, but it's got a nice security property is that you can use IOMMU almost like a firewall for access from devices to memory. And it can block access from a device to memory it's not supposed to read, and you can limit what's able to read. So IOMMU is a good mitigation. Currently, at least last time we checked, it wasn't being enabled by default on some of the popular operating systems and hypervisors. Fortunately, I think for some of the later versions of Linux, they have some options to enable it by default. So I recommend enabling IOMMU when available. Now moving on to talking about some of the physical memory extraction mitigations. This is the area that's less developed and where it's more of a new frontier. So there's several different kind of academic and approaches that have been published, as well as some more kind of practical schemes that I'll talk about. So the status quo today is that you can keep your disk encrypted, and your memory is going to have the key sitting in plain text memory. It's exposed. So you can do a cold boot, you can do a DMA attack, unless you use IOMMU. You can get at those keys. Now, one approach called CryptKeeper was the idea here is you're going to encrypt most of memory, and then keep the key in the little portion that remains. Now this is kind of just obscuring it because they don't really deal with the issue of where the key is. They propose some ideas about separate hardware or obfuscating it, but it doesn't really solve the problem. Somebody can get the key out. But if you have kind of a lazy attacker who's just going to look for plain text strings, it might help. Trezor, this is an approach that's a Linux kernel modification. So after all the cold boot stuff came out, the idea here is that you can keep like an AES key in the debug registers for a CPU, and they won't be kept in main memory. So if you do a cold boot, the key is kept in the CPU, and you can grab memory, and you're not going to be able to decrypt the disk. So you might get some contents of memory, but you're not going to get the full contents of the disk and be able to decrypt it offline. Frozen cache, this is kind of a different approach, and their idea is that if you've got a laptop and you want to screen lock it, you can put the key to the disk and all the code to do the unlock in the cache and freeze the cache. So if somebody comes in and takes the memory out of the system, it's not going to have the disk encryption key in there. And once you type in your password, that code's in the cache. It can, unlock the cache and then put the key back in main memory. So you'll be exposed while you're using your laptop, but while it's screen locked or you're going through, the airport security, the key won't be in memory. Karma, this is a paper out of CMU, and it's got a similar approach where they actually just don't use main memory. And their observation is that these L3 caches, the last level caches, are getting really big. The latest Intel server CPUs have ones that are 25, 30, 37.5 megs. And that's bigger than the first hard drive I ever had. So it's quite big, and you can run a full operating system in the L3 cache. So they run basically just a secure operating system in the cache on the CPU, no dependency on main memory. Now, putting together these ideas is something that I've been working on in my company. It's called a software crypto processor. So it's kind of a similar idea to Karma, where you keep the cache pinned, run an operating system in the cache, keep your key in the cache, and then encrypt access to main memory. And the technologies that made this possible are the fact that CPUs today have support for crypto in the instruction set. They have these huge L3 caches, and they also have random number generators, at least with Intel CPUs. So you've got randomness, you've got big space to work with, and the ability to do fast crypto. And somebody extracting the memory of the system just gets plain text, or excuse me, just gets ciphertext. So moving on to some upcoming technologies, I want to talk about these really quickly. So these are technologies that we expect to see in the pipeline. One is software-based attestation, and this is actually being used in some mobile contexts. But the idea is that you're going to have some metrics that you're going to measure from a system that's running, and if the good software is running, it should have predictable results. If somebody changes it, it should throw off those metrics very bad. Now the challenge here is you need to make sure you're not being simulated in a VM. So, if you've got a mobile device, you've got to make sure you're not talking to a mobile VM running on a powerful server. And one way to do this is with some keys rooted in hardware. Now, one technology that Intel has been talking about is called EPID, which is Enhanced Privacy ID. And this is kind of a successor to direct anonymous attestation, which is built into the TPMs today. And what it does is provide a CPU a way to anonymously sign data and not reveal its own identity. So it's like a group signature saying you're a member of a certain group, but not which individual. And so this could be a very powerful tool. And one thing that it's useful for is the fact that you've got some key material rooted in the CPU. So now CPUs can authenticate themselves without leaking which specific CPU it is. Now, that's also a downside, is that it's rooted in this unique key. So one technology that uses this EPID key or similar key material is called SGX, or Software Guard Extensions. And this was kind of quietly revealed last summer by Intel and has been blogged about a little bit, but hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And what SGX is a new set of instructions that are going to be coming out on future generations of Intel processors, probably in the next 2 to 3 years. And they allow you to run a small, secure enclave of user-level code that's inaccessible from other code in the system, even kernel-level code. That enclave is going to be backed by encrypted memory that's encrypted by hardware. So it's not going to be exposed to these physical attacks, and also not going to be exposed to any other malware running on the system based on this protection that they're building in the hardware. Enclaves are also going to be attested. So when you load one up, this hardware key built in the CPU is going to measure what's loaded and be able to do that attestation protocol with somebody else. So you can have enclaves attest each other, and you can also remotely, or should be able to remotely connect to an enclave and attest it. Now the downside is that all these pieces make it very useful for DRM. I can get my movie decrypting code running in an enclave. I can provision a key to it once I've attested it, and you as the user may not be able to look into there and see what's happening. So if you're trying to rip DVDs or doing whatever or find the key for that, it may become very hard using this technology. So I'm coming to the end of the talk. I want to just talk about a few things I'd like to see to actually improve the landscape out there. So I mentioned at the beginning that SMM is kind of a big hole. And there's supposed to be this notion of a SMM transfer monitor that you can use to actually isolate the SMM a bit And to date, I haven't seen an implementation that is usable. So this is something I'd like to see is some way to isolate the SMM or else otherwise protect yourself. SGX, as I mentioned, is going to have some hardware crypto support. I'd like to see that extended where you could use it for arbitrary memory and use it, for protecting whatever memory you want. And I'd also like to see a way to provision my own keys into the CPU. And that may not be feasible with manufacturing techniques, but if I can't do that, then someone up the chain does know some unique key material for that CPU. So if they've done it improperly or if there's some other backdoor, somebody might be able to identify my unique CPU. I'm not saying that's the way it works today, but just the fact it's got that unique key material makes it possible. And then finally, this is more specific toward the full memory encryption approach I discussed, but finer-grained L3 cache controls would be very useful. So the ability to lock cache lines or do cache coloring, this would make it easier to do some of these techniques where you can keep things in the cache and then encrypt everything that's paged to memory. One side effect is actually be very useful for preventing side channel attacks that are caused by cache evictions. So I'm out of time. I'm going to wrap it up here and I think take questions or that's it. All right, I'll take a question.
What do you think about TPM 2.0?
Question is, what do I think about TPM 2.0? So for a little background, there's a new TPM spec that is out and I think it's going to be shipping within a year. The big difference is that today certain countries don't allow the use of TPMs, and I think it's Russia and China. I'm not 100% sure. And TPM 2.0 is going to allow people to specify their own cipher suites. So China can specify their SM suite, Russia can do whatever they want. So that's the main difference I know about. They're improving some of the algorithms and things using, but generally an improvement. All right, thank you very much.